I saw that apparently AMC and a couple of other big movie chains in the States are kind of basing their reopening schedule on Tenet, Christopher Nolan's movie in July, which I think is
because that was the one that was like never gonna move.
Well, yeah, I think they know that, like, you know, as we both know and we talked about, I think when the Tenet trailer came out a few months ago, like Christopher Nolan is one of the last remaining directors who's kind of like appointment viewing in a theater, right? Like you kind of build your schedule around his movies being in and seeing them in like the biggest screen and the best like conditions possible. So he's got Tenet coming out scheduled for, I think, July 17th. And unlike a lot of other movies in the whole COVID-19 situation, the distributors, I guess Warner Brothers, didn't want to shift this. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world. It still feels like a long way away, but...
It is a long way away. That's 2 months away, more than 2 months.
But at least there's like two things about it that kind of gives me hope. It's like, A, it's a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, we have like a possible time when we can go back and start watching stuff in theaters again. And it's going to be one of the biggest movies, one of the best movies to see in a theater. So I can't think of a better way to kind of come back to watching movies again than a Christopher Nolan movie.
If this wasn't Christopher Nolan, I'd say you'd be setting up yourself for disappointment, but I'm just as excited for Tenet as any other Christopher Nolan movie, and so far he's never disappointed, so...
Sure, yeah.
Welcome to the 73rd episode of the Extra Buttery Podcast, a free-flowing conversation between two guys who love film and TV. My name is Jason Chen, and I'm joined by my co-host Robert Snow. Today, we discuss David Lynch's Dune, the 1984 sci-fi classic that will spawn a remake later this year. Under the Silver Lake, Andrew Garfield's slacker stoner whodunit about his neighbor who mysteriously disappears. Arctic, the Icelandic survival drama film starring Mads Mikkelsen. And The Last Dance, the ESPN documentary chronicling Michael Jordan's last season with the Chicago Bulls in 1998. So, Rob, you are one of the few people I know who've seen and know a lot about Dune.
Yeah, I guess so.
So this is like my first foray into Dune. It popped up on Netflix, and to my surprise, my mother has actually seen it. And she and I were both talking about how, like, she thought, because it came out a year after Return of the Jedi, how she thought in some ways it was better than Star Wars. And so that piqued my interest. So I went home and I watched it, and I was pretty blown away. I really, really enjoyed it.
Through sound and motion, you will be able to paralyze nerves, shatter bones, set fires, suffocate an enemy or burst his organs. We will kill until no Harkonnen breathes Arrakeen air.
Yeah, it is I watched it with my brother for the first time maybe like 2 years ago, because it's been on Netflix Canada for a couple of years now, and I mean, I guess, you know, with the popular consciousness of the movie, it was a bit of a bomb when it came out. Like, critics didn't like it. It was mired in like production hell. David Lynch had a really tough time actually making it. Lots of studio intervention and stuff. So I guess it was kind of like, it was probably a cheap acquisition for Netflix, and that's why it's been available. But yeah, I kind of stumbled into it too, and I think my first kind of, or what primed me to watch the Lynch movie was actually the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune,
Right.
which came out, I think, 2016, 2017. It was also on Netflix for a while. I'm not sure if it is right now. But that told the story of how Alejandro Jodorowsky is a Chilean director of very surrealist, odd art house type stuff, tried to make an adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune novel in 1974. And at the time, we're talking like 3 years before the original Star Wars, like there was very little appetite for big space opera type stuff with, you know, characters with unpronounceable names and strange dynasties and, you know, all of the things that we would recognize now from Star Wars was present in Dune. And, you know, Frank Herbert's original novel came out in 1965 before even the original Star Trek started. So like, it's kind of... it's one of those kind of weird series where its roots are in everything that we've enjoyed in sci-fi and fantasy in the past few decades, but very few people, probably like yourself and myself for the longest time, didn't really have an understanding of like how integrated it was.
Yeah, I think that's always sort of the case where like the pioneer never ever gets enough credit. So Dune has served the basis for a lot of sci-fi movies, kind of like how even though The Lord of the Rings for us is sort of like the first, fantasy epic book that we are introduced to, it's also based on a lot of previous works about like folklore, and even Harry Potter too takes a lot of sort of inspiration from previous literary works about heroes and good versus evil and this hero's journey. What most impressed me about Dune was that, unlike I think a lot of the critics, I didn't find it that hard to follow. It took me like the second watch to really sort of get everything, but the first time you see it, it's a pretty basic good versus evil tale about an ordained hero that comes. There are a lot of things that I thought were weird, and I think I briefly texted you about this, but in terms of like the special effects for that day and age, though, I thought they were pretty advanced. I think there are certain parts that drag, and to me, the second half of the movie, especially where Paul Atreides, the main character, becomes one of the Fremen, I think that part is a lot less interesting because that's just him ending up like kicking the bad guys' butts. There's less of a growth in his like internal journey as in the first half.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And like, I'm reading the original novel because I wanted to kind of immerse myself even more in anticipation of Denis Villeneuve's movie coming out in December, if it sticks to its schedule. And yeah, like I'm at that part now where Paul Atreides has, his family have come to this planet called it's called casually Dune, but its real name is Arrakis, and it's the only source in the galaxy for this valuable mineral called spice. And spice is kind of like a combination of a very wealthy tradable substance, but also a drug that can enhance a person's senses and turn their eyes this kind of brilliant shade of blue, including the white part, which makes the people who take it look a little bit extra creepy. But yeah, I'm at the point in the book where, his family they tried to take over Dune from the previous fief that had control of it, the Harkonnens, and he's been kicked out into the desert, and he's about to join up with the Fremen and, start that part of his journey. And yeah, I would say like, while I'm not at the end of the book yet, I am picking up on that same thing I remember from the movie where you do have that kind of construction of the Paul Atreides character off the top, and then things just kind of seem to be leveling out a little bit because he comes into his powers and then he's just like, nobody can oppose him.
Pretty early on too. Yeah.
Nobody can oppose him. He has like, he can drive the sandworms. He can, fight anybody, and I mean, maybe Herbert's novel does diverge from the movie at a certain point. I'll have to see in the next little bit as I finish it up.
Speaking of the new 2020 Dune, though, this actually really makes me really excited because if the 1984 Dune was bad, I don't think I'd be as open to it. I think part of the reason I'm also intrigued too, because it is in the 1984 version, there's like a huge part of the movie's internal dialogue, like characters whisper a narration and it's supposed to represent the thoughts that are going through their head. Right. And it's very obvious, but it's a little distracting at times. And I wonder how Denis Villeneuve is going to do that. Because a lot of Dune requires background knowledge, a lot of narration, a lot of exposition too. So I'm curious as to how they're going to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that Lynch in his movie took directly from the book because from what I've seen in the book, there is a lot of like internal dialogue there as well where, you've got Paul Atreides, who's he's the son of the Duke. He's been trained in all of these different powers, mentalist type powers where he can kind of read people's minds. He can anticipate what they want and things like that. So there's a lot of passages of the book that's kind of taken up with him performing that analysis so he can kind of think a few steps ahead. It would be, I don't know how Villeneuve would do that because he hasn't really worked with voiceover in a lot of his previous movies. Like there have definitely been characters who are very, internally focused, but they don't really, he doesn't bother to kind of make what they're thinking about that obvious.
Right. And he's also said a number of times that he's not taking inspiration from any other source, even the 1984 Dune. Like, this is his vision. This is how he imagined Dune to look like when he read the book as a boy, and it's right up his alley. So I'm really intrigued by it. I think I can see Timothée Chalamet as Paul Atreides working out very well. The rest of the cast hasn't been fully revealed, but we know most of the major characters. And I gotta say, Stellan Skarsgård has big shoes to fill as Baron Harkonnen, because the original Baron Harkonnen I thought was terrifying.
Yeah, well, the one thing with Lynch is, like, in that movie, and I think one of the reasons why maybe people in 1984 didn't respond very positively to it is, Dune is a very, very creepy, very weird kind of world, and
it's also for that time is politically charged, because a lot of people criticize Baron Harkonnen sort of being like a proxy for the criticism of the AIDS issue that was going on at the time, and like blatant anti-homosexuality.
Yeah, and he's built up with all of these prosthetics. He's this massively obese character who can't even move on his own. He has to get like these little floating things to kind of carry him around, these like little helicopter type things. There's this kind of this very loathsome visual that accompanies Harkonnen, and I mean, I can see them doing that with Skarsgård. Like, I can see Skarsgård kind of going the route of like the character he played in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, where he's got all this prosthetics and stuff added to him. So I can picture that in my mind. But then you've also got Oscar Isaac as Timothée Chalamet's father, Leto Atreides, Rebecca Ferguson as Lady Jessica, Timothée Chalamet's.
That's a great casting.
Yeah, like she's got that kind of like reserved kind of strength to her that I think the character calls for. And then as Duncan Idaho, you have who's like a soldier intelligence type guy. You've got Jason Momoa, and as Gurney Halleck, you have Josh Brolin. Who is played by Patrick Stewart in the 1984 film. Yeah. Who, by the way, I don't think has ever had hair, huh? No, apparently he lost his hair when he was in his 20s. So I was looking at it, I was like, is that Patrick Stewart? Wait, shouldn't he have hair because it's 1984? Wait, no, that is Patrick Stewart. Wait, has he never ever had hair? That's kind of the thought process you go through before you realize, oh, it is Patrick Stewart. There's a lot of other recognizable names in the original 1984 movie. Yeah, a lot of people who would go on to work with Lynch in some of his later projects, especially Twin Peaks, like Everett Gill or McGill, I forget. He goes on to be in Twin Peaks. Jack Nance, I think, was in there. Yeah, Kyle MacLachlan, obviously. Yeah, Kyle MacLachlan, obviously. Agent Cooper from Twin Peaks. He was David Lynch's hero in Dune. So it's worth a watch for sure. And, there's definitely some, I would say so, some Lynchian stuff, this grotesque kind of looking aliens and long periods of silence and things like that. There's also a lot of like sexual tension. Yes. Yeah. And that's something in Lynch anyway. Like, I mean, anyone who's seen Mulholland Drive or any of those movies, will recognize certain, this kind of like very overwhelming sense of tension and anxiety and stuff. Right. And I was asking you about this too after I watched the movie. Like, what was the deal with like the Space Guild's Worm character that was oddly phallic? I don't know. Like, there seemed dream sequences that Paul Atreides has, and it's just like things shooting out of holes, bunch of bright lights, bright designs, space, like images of space fading in and out. Like the beginning of the movie when Princess Irulan pops up, it's like her head, just like in the middle of the page in like with the space as a background, and she kind of fades in and out as she like narrates this, because at one point she's like, oh, I forgot to tell you something, and then her face fades back in, and it's really funny and very Lynchian too. I wish he was more proud of this film because I really enjoyed it, but the TV version was apparently the one that was hacked to bits by the production studios, and he famously rejected that version as well. Yeah, they just had a really bad time on it. Like, he was getting very oppressive kind of notes from the studio, and the studio was probably terrified about how much money there was being spent, and it was, the whole thing was just a bad time for everyone involved. And somebody asked Lynch whether he was interested in seeing the Villeneuve one, and he didn't really sound like he was. I imagine he doesn't want to be anywhere near that material anytime soon. But I'm excited by the stills that we've seen so far from Vanity Fair. I'm sure a trailer will probably not too far away if they've got the production stills out. It's not just the one movie either. They're going to do a second movie, assuming that this one isn't a complete financial failure. So that's something to look forward to at the end of the year.
I think the obvious split, as you said before, is the 2-year gap where he becomes part of the Fremen, but we shall see. Speaking of a bad time at theaters, there was a movie I saw at 2018 Vancouver International Film Festival that a lot of people liked, but I walked to the theater being one of the haters. And I want to get your thoughts on this. This is Under the Silver Lake, a sort of slacker stoner comedy drama whodunit about a guy, played by Andrew Garfield, who quickly falls in love with his neighbor played by Riley Keough, who all of a sudden disappears. Yeah,
and that's basically all you have to go on. It's set in LA, and I think not in 2018, but maybe they dated it at some point in the actual script of the movie. It was 2010 or something like that. So not really far back, but at least a few years from the date of the movie's release. So that kind of gives you a sense of the time period. And we're never quite clear what Andrew Garfield's character does for a living. It's suggested that maybe he works in the movie business, maybe he's an actor. But we know that he hasn't been working in a while, and he's almost flat broke. His landlord wants to kick him out of his apartment. His muscle car gets repossessed. He's just got a bundle of bills in his pocket, and that's pretty much it. And no real reason to do anything, but he happens to notice this girl move in next door to him, and he wants to kind of start something with her, a relationship. He feels like there's a connection, and then she just moves out in the middle of the night. And he kind of starts off on this sort of shambolic kind of investigation. He's not a private eye. He doesn't have any kind of real skills to actually track her down, but he kind of sort of flops his way into a series of scenarios, kind of like Joaquin Phoenix's character in Inherent Vice, and slowly uncovers this kind of conspiracy that's maybe not a conspiracy, but it involves rich people in LA, and yeah.
Well, isn't she pretty? Earth Angel, Earth Angel.
She was killed.
Oh, won't you be mine? Well,
along with Jefferson Sevens, but I think you already knew that. Yeah.
No, I did not. I don't care what's fashionable or cool. It's all silly and it's all meaningless.
After you said you watched this movie, I actually went back to Letterboxd and just kind of dug up what I wrote. And one of the lines I wrote was that you should save your money and watch Inherent Vice instead, because it is just that much better film. So the thing that people love about this film is they like to point out all the Easter eggs that are apparently sprinkled throughout.
Right.
I hate that in movies. You already know that.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in his journey, and these clues that he gets are just either too ridiculous to believe, or it goes over your head if you don't get the reference. And all of a sudden at the end, he kind of stumbles upon this truth that he ends up confronting this cult, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so what you're left with is this really meandering sort of movie where you kind of watch Andrew Garfield fumble around. Although I think visually it is very interesting, plot-wise, character-wise, even dialogue-wise, I found it a little tough to follow and tough to actually know why this movie was actually made. But do you understand why people like it? That, to me, was the most baffling thing.
I mean, at the risk of sounding I have a serious case of FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah.
I feel like this is a movie that, if you're in a certain clique, specifically people who either live in the neighborhood of Silver Lake in LA,
right,
which is known as being
a real place.
Yeah. It's known as being the hipster kingdom of LA. Kind of the Brooklyn of Williamsburg, that kind of demographic, fairly affluent 30 and 40 somethings, all living together, going to each other's secret record launches and, screenings of dumb indie movies that aren't actually going to make any money, and, eating at vegan, restaurants and that kind of thing. So that's like where it's set. And I feel like part of this movie is about kind of like gently satirizing those people and kind of pointing out that, like, you know, their existence is a little bit pretentious, or maybe a lot pretentious. And
if it is satire, though, it was lost on me that because it doesn't lampoon them enough.
No, it doesn't. It kind of goes a little bit down that road, and then it kind of like flops over into like a hardcore, hard-boiled kind of noir type thing.
Right.
So it wants a little bit of everything. And then, you know, like you were saying, there's all these movie references to like How to Marry a Millionaire and other 1950s like slapstick comedies. And so there's a bit of like a La La Land, Damien Chazelle movie nerd kind of thing sprinkled over it, where,
yes.
you know, you can take a drink every time you see a classic movie poster for a movie that you've seen and probably get really wasted by the end of it. But I sort of identify with that kind of love of movies, but I don't know. It doesn't feel like it really loves movies. It just feels like, you know, it's kind of saying that really shitty people can also live in LA and claim to be fans of all of these classic works of art, but not really understand them or really identify with them.
For how much it talks about like what kind of films are good and what kind of films are worthwhile, this is not, to me, a worthwhile film in itself.
No, Garfield's character has no arc. Like, you know, he really
doesn't.
They kind of have him conclude things by discovering that not only did he really not learn anything or grow at all as a character over the course of it, but the cult that he kind of exposed doesn't really matter. And like, there's really like nobody who's involved in it really wants out.
This is sort of like the time where I was really kind of anti Andrew Garfield. I didn't really like him as Spider-Man, and this is just another movie where I just got constantly annoyed by him and his character. And fittingly, I think he played that character very well. It's hard for me to imagine another actor in his place. This is also, I think, the beginning of my love affair with Riley Keough.
Yeah, but then they're like,
she's in it for like 5 minutes though, eh? Like it is definitely in Andrew Garfield. Let's see how many times we can have a deer stuck in his headlights look on his face, because he just like discovered something so tangential to what he's actually looking for that you're supposed to be intrigued and sort of move on with him in this mystery journey that ultimately has no villain, has no like twist, or has no real victim. Actually, the victim is us. Like, I can't believe I paid for this, but
and it's such a mixed bag. I mean, like, you know, I get some people have said that they enjoy the movie for all those references that we've talked about, but also the fact that it has no conclusive ending, like the fact that nothing matters, and that it's
so meta, and a movie without a beginning or end.
Yeah, and I'm like, that's just nihilism. Like, to me, that just doesn't, you know.
That to me is a waste of time.
If you're that frustrated about living in Silver Lake and putting up with people's, you know, wealthy parties and stuff like that, like, just move.
Right. Like,
don't make a movie about it. It feels a little bit like the director was kind of pouring a little bit of frustration into this. The other thing that and this was pointed out by a guest that we've had on the show before, Peter Henderson, a good friend of ours. There's a bit of a current of misogyny running through this movie.
There is,
and violence too. That is a little bit hard to take in certain scenes. Like, there are.
I don't remember the violence. What scene are you talking about?
At one point, Andrew Garfield like kills a wealthy dude in his mansion by smashing his brains in with Kurt Cobain's guitar. And then like the movie never acknowledges what the impact of that is. Like, okay, he just murdered a guy. Like,
it clearly wasn't memorable, right?
Yeah.
So.
And at another point, like, he catches his kids like playing pranks on people by like keying their cars and stuffing bubble gum in the handles and stuff. Mm-hmm. And he catches one of the kids who's doing it further down the street and like pummels him almost to death with his fists.
I actually found that scene kind of funny because I thought that kid he deserved it, but
the kid probably deserved a quick tap or something, but Garfield's character goes on him like really hard for what is essentially just a prank, you know.
It becomes a bit of a fetish, right? Kind of like Tarantino with his violence. Yeah,
it's clear like Garfield's character has like a violence or an anger problem or something that's not well managed. But
let's face it, all these hipsters have huge problems that need to be addressed. But
and then there's like, you know, the like obviously Garfield is he does his own share of nude scenes in this movie because there's a few sex scenes kind of sprinkled in and out, but there's a way higher proportion of just totally naked women just wandering around for no good reason. There's a subplot about like an assassin type character wearing an owl mask who's just like a naked woman wandering around wearing this owl mask and ripping people's throats out. There are other women who just like I get it. Andrew Garfield's an attractive guy, but like he has no trouble getting women who then usually meet like rather violent ends. You know, he ends up having sex with a woman in the Silver Lake Reservoir, but then she's shot by somebody mysteriously, and she just kind of like tumbles to the bottom of the reservoir, totally naked but covered in blood. And so there's an exploitation kind of flavor to it that doesn't help
a little bit. Like they want you to make this character feel paranoid, right? And
sure.
He is to a certain extent, but it just never goes through all the way with any of its ideas. That was the most frustrating part to me.
Yeah. So yeah, if you see this thing come up, like, you know, maybe you're one of those people who likes that kind of like cyclical, vaguely nihilist kind of stuff, and maybe it's for you, but I would say more likely than not, it's worth a pass.
It made a couple top 10 lists for critics, which I don't understand, but sure.
There's people out there who identify with that kind of ennui, that kind of, you know, midlife crisis or early midlife crisis kind of LA-based lifestyle. I don't know.
Right. Speaking of movies that tend to alienate people, though, I'm curious about, because I actually haven't heard of this at all, but how did you find out about Arctic?
Yeah, so this is something that it came up on Amazon a few months ago. Maybe it had been there for a while. It's a 2018 movie, and it's a man versus nature movie about a guy played by Mads Mikkelsen who has found himself stranded in, you know, north of the Arctic Circle, victim of a plane crash, the only survivor. And the only way I found out about this movie was because I had been following the director from a very long time ago when he started out as a YouTuber. So the director's name is Joe Penna, but people on the internet might know him better by his YouTube channel name, Mystery Guitar Man. And he's like one of the original, like back in the very founding of YouTube kind of creators, where he made a name for himself creating these very kind of eccentric musical videos where he would appear on camera with this kind of crazy hair and this pair of sunglasses, and he would be using fast editing and kind of cloning multiple versions of himself playing different eccentric instruments to kind of recreate recognizable pop songs. And his videos would be very short, like maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes long, but they clearly took huge amounts of effort to produce, where he was individually recording like sounds and then kind of slowly layering them together to create a song that you recognize. And he did that for a long time. He probably made a decent amount of money doing it, you know, on that first wave of YouTube talent. And then he slowly transitioned into short films. And most of the short films of his that he posted on YouTube had kind of like a sci-fi flavor to them. So I guess he was able to get the financing together to make his first feature, and decided to kind of move away from all the stuff that he was doing on YouTube, you know, the sci-fi shorts and the musical videos and stuff, and just do a straight up man v nature kind of thing.
Right. So this movie, The Arctic, or just Arctic actually, reported budget of $2 million, so very low budget film. Grossed about $4 million at the box office, and it is basically Castaway, but with Mads Mikkelsen and in the Arctic. So we don't actually sort of see the origins of how he ended up there. The movie just starts with him trying to survive day-to-day life. And he's already at the point where he's got fishing lines, he's got a routine, he's dug out SOS in the snow, and he's waiting for a response. And one day a helicopter comes, but a wind comes, helicopter crashes, and he ends up saving one of the two pilots in the helicopter that's supposed to come and save him.
Can you hear me? Hello. Do you understand English? Can you squeeze like this? Squeeze.
And so what you have is this man versus nature, but also man versus time conflict, because he's got to get the female pilot who's injured heavily from his encampment to a outpost that is several days hikes away. And so what you get is this very taut, very minimal dialogue film in which Mads Mikkelsen's physicality in his portrayal as this man, a guy who's been living in the Arctic for God knows how long, is so good. I'm so kind of surprised that this film didn't get as much buzz as it did, because to me, this is one of the better survival films that I've seen. It kind of reminds me of Rescue Dawn. I don't know if you remember that, but that's a Christian Bale survival movie that was actually really good, but also just didn't get enough attention.
Yeah, that was a Werner Herzog movie, actually.
Exactly. And I'm just wondering, like, why is it that these sort of survival movies tend not to do well? And remember, we went to see The Grey too with Liam Neeson. That didn't do that well either. Although I found that as a weaker film, but that's another conversation. Throughout the whole film, I felt cold.
Yes.
Like, yeah. It's in the middle of April we're watching this, or late April, and I felt cold. Like, I felt freezing like Mads Mikkelsen was.
Yeah. And you have to, like, you know, as an actor, like Mikkelsen, you know, actors have a limited kind of stable of things that they can do on camera to keep you interested. Yeah. And for a movie that has so little dialogue, you know, Mikkelsen maybe goes like 15 minutes at a time without even saying anything.
Yeah. He just goes, fish, eat, you must eat, fish.
Yeah.
So apparently this film was shot over 19 days, and Mikkelsen afterwards said that this was one of probably the hardest film he ever had to make.
I believe it. I mean, he has to, like, not only is he physically like out in the elements, but his character has to do all kinds of things like try to tow the woman that he's taking care of up this vertical cliff, essentially.
Right.
And, you know, physically walk through these incredible distances while towing a giant sled behind him. Mm-hmm. And all of these things that, like, you know, as a human being, it must be a huge...
it's like a monumental task, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like all these survival stories are stories about willpower, about overcoming like outstanding and crazy odds just to survive.
Yeah, and I guess like maybe the reason these movies don't do super well is, you know, there's probably a significant chunk of the audience out there that, you know, when they go to the movies, they want escapism, and they want what they can recognize as like a pretty clear path to resolution. You know, not to paint everybody with a broad brush, but like you go to see an Avengers movie and you know that roughly speaking, even if you don't get to the end game kind of thing right away, it might take you a few movies to get there. The movie that you are watching at that moment will have some kind of resolution, and roughly speaking, the good guys are going to win. But in the survival movies, like there's a pretty 50-50 chance that all the characters are going to die at the end. Yes. And you're just supposed to like, you know, be impressed by how much they sacrificed to even get to where they did when they died.
Yeah, that's a great point about characters not being expected to survive.
Yeah, and it's a hard sell for people. Like if you're going to go to the movies and you're going to relax after a hard day at work, and you know you're going to be told, "Oh, I have to watch a person like physically like rip themselves apart to try to like claw their way back to civilization." Like maybe it's not the easiest sell for people. I don't know. Mm-hmm. The other. What was the other movie that this reminded me of? Oh, yeah. The last movie that came out that kind of followed this rubric that I also quite liked was called All Is Lost with Robert Redford. Came out, I think, 2016, 2017, thereabouts. And in that...
2013.
Oh, it was older. Okay, so, yeah. And this is like... this one doesn't even have the benefit of a second human being for the actor to play off of. This is just Robert Redford alone on a boat, like lost in the Pacific. And he's got to contend with like, you know, a whole different landscape. Obviously, he's out in the middle of the water. And again, like hardly any dialogue at all. You can only like grab little bits of information about how the guy came to be in that situation from like looking very carefully at the frame and kind of analyzing things, mm-hmm. and, you know, all of that. So it does take a little bit of effort on the viewer's part to kind of like stay committed to the character.
There are two other takeaways about this film. The one of them was that it amazes me, like it puts into perspective how amazingly successful Castaway was. not only was Castaway like a critical success, it was a box office hit.
Yeah.
And I don't know. So I think there is something to be said about man being stranded on an island full of coconuts versus man being stranded in the Arctic against polar bears. I think one is more welcoming to the viewer than the other.
Yeah.
Because if you're stranded on an island, it's like, hey, he's got the beach and sunshine and coconuts. What else? And let's not forget, Wilson is probably one of the best supporting characters in film of all time.
Yeah, well, there's like two things there. I think like, yeah, you're totally right. Like the worst thing that Tom Hanks has to worry about is maybe like sunstroke from a survivability. At least he's got ready access to fish and shelter, and just going out, getting up in the morning doesn't involve like possibly dying from exposure.
Right.
So like, yeah, there's like on a survivability level, it's definitely a different story. Like Mikkelsen's got the harder task. But the thing with Castaway though, that probably made it a bigger success with both audiences and critics was it doesn't have that kind of like effort on the viewer's part, because we see there's a more clear character arc.
Right.
We see where Tom Hanks's character began. We know that he was kind of like a bit of an asshole. He made a lot of an asshole. And then we see how his experience being stranded on the island changes him. And it doesn't necessarily give us all the answers at the end. There's a bit of an ambiguous ending at the end of Castaway, but we see how, maybe he's a better guy now. Arctic and All Is Lost, like maybe these dudes are really bad people and they actually didn't learn a whole lot, but they at least like accomplished this huge feat of staying alive despite the circumstances.
The second point I want to talk about is that this film really teases it out, like how you think Mads Mikkelsen is going to survive. By the end of the film, it gets really, really bleak. You're almost at the point where like, all right, this movie's just going to end with both of the characters dying. There's no way this ends anywhere else.
Yeah.
But spoilers ahead. By the end, he manages to contact this helicopter, and this helicopter is like within visible distance, and he lights his flare, and he even burns his parka to catch their attention. And he starts waving, starts yelling like a madman. And then the two helicopters kind of just like walk around, look around, and then just get back in the helicopter. And it's implied that they don't see him. And then as he's like on his last dying breath, he's kind of lying there on the Arctic tundra, just ready to die. The helicopter just kind of like appears like in the background, indicating that they have been saved. That part to me felt cheap because it kind of played with your emotions one more. It's kind of one of those like gotcha moments at the end of the film that I really, really hate, because the entire time you're so tense, you see the helicopter, you let your guard down. You're like, finally, all right, a sense of relief. And then it flies away. Then it turns, instead of to like fear, it turns into anger, because you're like, how dare you fake me out like that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a cake and eat it too kind of situation.
Yes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah,
that was my only gripe about the whole like structure of the movie. That part really kind of annoys me.
I can see that being divisive. I mean, there's a movie that I watched at TIFF maybe 2 or 3 years ago, as a Canadian movie with Dane DeHaan and Tatiana Maslany, and the movie's called Two Lovers and a Bear. And it's set in the Canadian Arctic, around like a community, and it kind of, there's more people around, it's kind of like a drama with like a background of like abuse and drug addiction. It's not the most uplifting material, but there's a bit of a supernatural kind of thing running through it, where I can't remember if it's Dane DeHaan's character or Maslany's character, but they have the ability to speak to this kind of polar bear who's wandering around. And the polar bear has the voice of esteemed Canadian actor Gordon Pinsent. And so they have this kind of like dialogue that goes over the course of the movie. Eventually, Dane DeHaan and Tatiana Maslany's character have to like run away from their lives in this small community, and they go off very foolhardily into the wild with just a snowmobile and some supplies, and they end up like having to shelter from a storm, and then they die. The characters just die at the end. And they literally like, they dug themselves into an igloo, and then they get frozen into the igloo in a block of ice. And I think one of the final shots of the movie is them being cut out of the igloo in a block of ice, like just like frozen, like, like caveman style. And it's a combination of like, the movie it wasn't very good, and it didn't really sustain that stuff, but it did, the one thing that it did do that Arctic, kind of decided to play a little bit fast and loose with was it committed to the ending, you know?
Right.
I mean, it was bleak going up until that point, and it decided to stick the bleak stuff right through to the end. So you can't say that they faked it out.
Right. Speaking of not faking anything, this is the documentary The Last Dance. This was one of the most hyped documentaries, sports documentaries from recent memory I can ever remember, actually. And it's a Netflix, ESPN co-production, ESPN in the States, Netflix in Canada. And we're about 2 episodes into this 10-episode documentary. And so far, it has been fantastic.
So they're doing like a weekly release, like every one episode a week?
Yes, two episodes per week. And because ESPN has broadcasting rights in the States, it is released every Sunday. So Netflix will get it worldwide the day after, so it'll be every Monday. So over the next 4 weeks, since we already got 2 episodes, we will get the whole shebang. And it's essentially about Michael Jordan and the 1997-98 Chicago Bulls season. The season they won their 6th championship and basically brought about the end of the Chicago Bulls dynasty that was so dominant throughout the 90s.
Our biggest challenge is us.
I am cursed with this mentality of competitiveness.
Competition was an addiction.
Every day was a battle.
Dennis, get up here!
Boom. You don't hear it, see Dennis for 48 hours.
No matter what we did, it seemed like it was a story.
And also a huge, I think, landmark in pop culture because of Michael Jordan's lasting legacy as probably the best basketball player of all time. Certainly one that our generation attaches itself to, and also for his impact on the shoe industry. The Jordan shoe still today outsells any other shoe made by, sponsored, or released by any other basketball player in the world. I know you're not like a huge basketball fan, Rob, but I do highly recommend it because it's not only about basketball, it's about egos and power and money. Everything that we love about people in billion-dollar industries.
Right. Well, I have like a tangential kind of like I've orbited the world of basketball in certain ways. Like I watched Steven Soderbergh's movie High Flying Bird last year. And
have you seen Hoop Dreams?
I have seen Hoop Dreams, so that was like, you know, I've kind of like, you know, I've been touching down in these certain things that are about basketball, but without ever really learning all of the people involved or the history or anything. All I know about this period, though, is unfortunately Space Jam. So, you know, I know from Space Jam that like they managed to work in this part into that movie where he becomes a baseball player rather ill-advisedly. Mm-hmm. And they kind of crack a few jokes about that as like a career move, and then, you know, imply that he gets back into basketball because of his experience beating the Monstars and the Looney Tunes world. So where does the Space Jam fit into the chronology of what we're seeing in this series?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me look up when Space Jam was released because I believe it was 96. Okay, so Space Jam was released in 1996. This Bulls documentary season occurs after Space Jam. So by this time, Michael Jordan was at the peak of his power. There was no other player in basketball that was more powerful than him. So Michael Jordan actually retired twice. So he retired in 1993 with the baseball thing, as you said, came back in 95, did Space Jam. And this part of his NBA career was at the time where people thought, well, you know what, maybe he's too old. We don't exactly know why he went into baseball. There are a lot of stories in the past about why he actually did it. And it culminates in his second retirement from the NBA, and then only to see him come back with the Washington Wizards much later on when he was in his 30s. But this is important because this season was the last season the Chicago Bulls sort of core players were kept together because of money reasons, ego reasons, backstabbing reasons. The footage that they've got was filmed throughout the season, but only now has it been released. And it has only been released now because Michael Jordan said he could. So if you watch it, keep in mind that this is very much Jordan's story. I think it is very much an unapologetic look at how brutal and how unforgiving Jordan is as a teammate, because he is brutal. He's famously known to have made like his teammates cry, ended careers because he's such a hard ass. But at the same time, it kind of paints him in this light as sort of like a hero who does not compromise. And we like heroes that don't compromise because the goal they're trying to attain is something honorable or something big, something bigger than everyone else.
Right. It's kind of like that's a something that plays out in like other sports as well, where like sometimes you just have to,
yeah, exactly,
push through and not get too worried about how people feel about something. Yeah.
Exactly. So he's sacrificing sort of like a nice guy image or the greatest player ever to show people like how rough and tough and how difficult it was for him. And granted, it is one of the top stories ever. The finals against the Utah Jazz is the stuff of legend, basically. But I do think if you can get past the first 2 episodes, which are out now, I think it's worthwhile, because from what I've heard, and very few people have actually seen all the footage that has been filmed in season, the next episodes are apparently just fireworks. Like, never have we ever had this kind of look at one of the greatest athletes in the world. It's kind of like that documentary When We Were Kings, about the Muhammad Ali fight, Rumble in the Jungle, where it was filmed for many years. The couldn't get financing, and all of a sudden they released this documentary and it just blew everything wide open.
Right. Yeah. It's like this isn't a completely different industry altogether, but the recent Netflix thing where they released Orson Welles's fabled final production, The Other Side of the Wind, and then at the same time released the making of documentary. And it turned out that the making of documentary was actually a more interesting watch, because it talked about just how screwed up everything was on the set of this movie. And it gave you some insight into, the Hollywood industry and that kind of thing at the time. And, the stuff that Wells had to put up with and that kind of thing. And his own, Wells' own, appetites and predilections, making things harder. Sometimes it's like, when there's been a long wait to actually see something, when you finally peel back that curtain, it's like you can understand why there's so much drama there.
And a lot of people point out, and this became news recently, is that so the most apt comparison people have to the modern day Michael Jordan for a lot of people was Kobe Bryant. And so it just came out that Kobe Bryant actually also hired a film crew to document his last ever season. And considering how successful this has been, I'm pretty sure that we will see a Kobe Bryant Last Dance type documentary in the near future.
It's funny how Netflix has kind of made a thing out of the basketball specifically, more so than other sports, I would say, because they have like the Soderbergh movie, and then they have Uncut Gems has a whole subplot to do with basketball, and that's very tied in. And now this documentary, and I could see the Kobe thing making its way to Netflix too. It's
interesting that people gravitate towards basketball. I don't know if it's because we're in North America, but basketball is just a big thing here, right? Soccer is the global thing, but basketball is a very the first, I'd say, sport that was marketed overseas that did super well. Hockey can't do it. Boxing, a little limited because it can be so brutal that it doesn't generate fans from a younger demographic. And I think basketball too, it's apparent when you see if someone is good. If a guy puts in the ball into the basket a lot, you probably have a good sense of how good he is. It's not like soccer or hockey where sometimes greatness is a little harder to see. Not to mention that basketball also has a lot of ties to poverty, the great American dream. As we've seen in Hoop Dreams, a lot of inner city kids, especially black kids, they idolize these players and they sacrifice a lot of things to do what their heroes can do, even though we know, and maybe they know as well, the odds are very much against them. So it becomes this sort of story about triumph, I think.
Yeah.
And I think the NBA is far more accessible than, say, the National Football League, which has very similar stories, but again, a very violent sport that doesn't have an audience outside of North America at all.
Yeah, and it has like bigger kind of requirements on the kids participating, where they need to buy the gear, like the helmets and the pads and stuff. The same thing with hockey, where hockey can be expensive for families to get into.
Yes,
if you
very expensive.
Buy all the stuff. I guess less so with baseball, because all you need is a stick and a ball. But
so the difference between baseball is that you need a field. So that's always been the biggest barrier to entry. Like in basketball, you can stick a basket on a wall anywhere,
sure,
right?
Yeah,
with baseball, you need a big field, and those can be hard to come by.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. Like I was saying when we were talking about Uncut Gems, like I have no like real historical understanding of the people involved. So when I ended up loving that movie, but then you were unconvinced until you heard that KG was in it.
You again buried the lead.
That was just a funny like extra dimension to it that I was totally unaware of. So like I could, because I've kind of been consuming a lot of like this basketball adjacent stuff on Netflix, maybe I could get into The Last Dance without too much trouble.
Yeah, so it sets the stage pretty well. Like there's a lot of background information to go through, but they do a really good job. And unlike most documentaries, kind of like the OJ doc that Made in America, the first few episodes are background knowledge, and then it gets really into the good stuff, because you really need to have an idea of what's going on before they get to the sort of conflicts that arise from all this. Well, that's all the time that we had.
As always, follow us on Twitter. Leave a review on the podcast, like whatever app you're using to listen to the podcast. Try to leave a review, because that helps us out a lot when it comes to like visibility. Sharing it with other people, helping more people discover this wonderful time we have.
Please listen and rate.
Yes,
and like. And whatever buttons they tell you to use.
Just feed that algorithm.
Just click all of them.
Head on over to kinetoscope.ca, where you'll be able to read a review by Jason on Extraction, the Chris Hemsworth action vehicle that just hit Netflix, as well as a couple of articles that I wrote on The Expanse and what it's like to watch that while we're in quarantine, the kind of weird way that show syncs up with the virus. And Tales from the Loop, which we talked about on the previous episode. I've got it all written up for you if you want a little bit more detail on that. But until the next episode, my name is Robert Snow in Toronto.
And my name is Jason Chen in Vancouver. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.